All right, welcome to Bible by Ages, class number 13. We are continuing today with our study of the Abrahamic age. Um, Brother Kenneth, I want to welcome you to the class. I will just kind of briefly outline what the class is about for you. We call it the. Did you ever read the Bible in 8 ages, or did Brother Baggett ever, or Brother Steve ever teach through it back in the day? He didn't. Okay. Well, Bible in 8 ages is a study of the entire Bible in one year. um, you have got things like the Old Testament survey and the New Testament survey that you would kind of picture that as a helicopter flight over the Bible. Okay. Well, the Bible in 8 ages is kind of a satellite view above the entire Bible. We start with before there was anything but God, and we go all the way to the heaven ages after the Lord has accomplished all things. The purpose is to be able to zoom out and see God's entire plan of the ages from the beginning to the end. To see that through everything, God is on the throne, and that through everything, God is in control, and that God has ultimately got a plan. Of course, chief amongst God's plans is the salvation of the human race. And we see that God has unfolded his one plan of salvation through multiple different ages. Um, we do believe, at least I do, and I know Steve did back in the day, in what's called a pre-Adamic age. And that means that there was a time where God had created the earth, but there was no man upon it. Okay? I believe that there was a time before Lucifer fell that Lucifer and his angels were over the material creation, just as Michael is over and his angels are over the spirit realm, and as Gabriel and his angels are over the intellectual realm. I believe that when Lucifer sinned, part of his sin was that he left his habitation here on the earth and he wanted to take over heaven. And as a result of his rebellion against God, death and destruction was brought upon that old world. God judged it. The world became without form and void. Who knows how long it became that way? But a few thousand years ago, God said, "Let there be light." God created man on the earth. After 6 literal days of reconstruction, there was no evolution. Evolution is totally ungodly. It's totally foreign to the Bible. Everything was created directly by God, including man. Man sinned against God, and so God instituted his plan of salvation. There is only one plan of salvation. And in 7 dispensations, over the second through the 8th ages, God is unfolding that one plan of salvation. So we've got the pre-Adamic age, and then from the human standpoint, we've got the Adamic age. Now, someone tell me, what was the primary dispensation that God gave during the Adamic age? What did man receive to show him that he needed a Savior, to show him that he was not sufficient to save himself? A conscience, okay? Now, what is necessary for a conscience? Adam and Eve stole the knowledge of good and evil, but if that was a conscience, it could not be said that God gave it to them, right? Because they stole it. So it's more than just a knowledge of good and evil. What else is conscience? I'll give you an example. Are there people in this world who know that they're doing wrong, but they do not care? They feel no guilt over it whatsoever? You can't say they have a conscience, do you? At least not one that's functioning. They have one that's seared, they have one that's hardened, but they're doing wrong without any conscience telling them or bothering them about it. So you need more than a knowledge of good and evil for you to have a conscience. So what did God give man in addition to the knowledge of good and evil that he stole by eating the forbidden fruit? What did God bring that basically gave man a conscience? What was Adam and Eve's first response once they were had partaken of that forbidden fruit and knew that they were naked? What was their initial reaction? Shame? Was their initial reaction repentance? Was their initial reaction that they had done something wrong? What did they do immediately? Nope, they did something else first. Adam blamed God, but that was later. What did he do first?
Tried to cover their sin.
They tried to cover it themselves. Okay, they made loincloths out of fig leaves, basically. That is what false religion does. False religion tries to salve our sense of wrongdoing, but the very moment that God showed up and said, Adam, where art thou? What did they do, Adam and Eve? They bolted for the bushes. So what God brought was conviction. Okay? That is the element that God gave to man, was a spiritual conviction of his sin. Now, when Cain murdered Abel, the first baby ever born murdered the second baby ever born, which kind of showed us what direction the human race was headed in. What was the consequence for Cain?
He had traveled the earth and he got the mark, no one could kill him.
Okay, that's exactly right. He was God said, I'm going to make you a vagabond in the earth. And Cain cried out for mercy, not because he was sorry, but just because he cared about himself. Have you ever seen someone who, like a murderer at court, who expressed grief and sorrow, but they're not really sorry for what they did, they're just sorry because they got caught? That's basically where Cain was at. But did God still have mercy on him? Yes. Okay? He said, whosoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. And he put that mark on Cain so that anyone who found him could not kill him. Now, for the online students, I understand we're recapping some stuff that we've already covered, but we have a new student in class today, and I'm wanting to catch him up, and it's also a good opportunity to review the students here who are in class, okay? So, did God authorize anything in addition to man's conscience during the Adamic age? Was there any human government allowed? No. All man had was his conscience. Let your conscience be your guide. Brother Anthony, what was the result of that? The result of man not having any government. Only let your conscience be your guide. 1,000 years later, in the days of Noah, what was the world like?
Nothing but his family.
Nothing but his family. But what was the condition of the world, Brother Christian?
Well, it said every evil thought was in their mind. I mean, anything evil,
Yeah.
they knew, they thought of.
It was as bad as it could be. What does that tell us about these modern ideas about getting rid of the police and getting rid of the courts and stuff? What would be the result? As imperfect as our system is, what would be the result of doing away with law and order, the government, police, courts, stuff like that? Where would we be? We'd be back to anarchy, and we're getting there anyway, and a large part of it is the erosion of law and order. So, come the days of Noah, we move from the Adamic age into the flood age. During the flood age, God wiped the slate clean with the flood, and we always think of the rainbow as part of that Noahic covenant, because that's what we spent most of our time studying when we were kids in Sunday school. God gave us the rainbow, promising he'd never again destroy the earth with the flood. But was that the only part of God's covenant with Noah? What were some other things that God made a covenant with Noah about that we almost never talked about in Sunday school? I always talk about the rainbow, but what other things were there in that Noahic covenant? Prior to the flood, was man allowed by God to eat meat? No. What did God say to Adam and Eve was to be their food? Yeah, basically the fruit of the ground, okay? What about, we just discussed it, human government. There was no human government before the flood. But what did God tell Noah? Whosoever sheds man's blood, By man's hand shall his blood be shed. God instituted human government. He commanded the death penalty for murderers. All right?
And he meant murder.
And he meant murder, yes. He was not talking about accidents. The Old Testament covers things like if I'm out there chopping wood and my axe head flies off and hits Anthony in the head, his family's going to want to get me, but what do I have the option to do? Run to the city of refuge, okay, and present myself to the priests and state my case, okay. Now, if it's determined that I actually murdered him in cold blood, they could drag me from the altar, could they not? I could be at the altar of God, and they could drag me away from it and stone me to death. What's the idea behind the death penalty? Is it retribution? Doesn't Jesus say, judge not lest you be judged? How do we reconcile, and we've talked about this in class, but I just want to review you, how do we reconcile Jesus' statements on forgiving and Jesus' statements on judge not lest you be judged with God's command to execute murderers, as in cold-blooded murderers, to execute them? What does the New Testament countermand what God gave to Noah in those days? Why not?
Because it's not talking to judges, it's talking to just people.
Absolutely right. There is a difference between an individual person and the government. God instituted government, according to the book of Romans, for two purposes: to reward good and punish evil. Okay? So, Brother Christian, if you are ever made a judge in Mississippi, for whatever reason, all right, if a murderer is brought before you and you are convinced by a presentation of the facts and a jury of this man's peers has found him guilty of murder, you are perfectly within your rights under the eyes of God to sentence that man to death. And you are not guilty of judging lest you be judged. Because if he is a judge, who put him there? God did. That's exactly right. Okay? If he's doing his job. So, human government was given during the days of Noah. And yet, what was the result? After Noah and his family get off the ark and they start multiplying, what did we talk about last week? Well, who came to power? Anybody remember? All right, who's ever, I'm not trying to preach politics, but I'm just preaching the Bible here, okay? How are governments described in the Bible? What is used to symbolize them? Think to the book of Daniel. Babylon was symbolized by a lion. All right? What was Persia symbolized by? A bear. What was Greece symbolized by? Four-headed leper. All right? What was Rome characterized by? A monster. That's basically what it was described as, a nondescript monster. What is the Antichrist government called, and what is the Antichrist himself called in the end times? The mark of the what? The beast. So what is used to symbolize governments? Beasts. Okay? That's God's way of telling us that a human government is at best a necessary evil. You've got some governments that are better than others, but at heart, all governments are imperfect. So, what was the result of the end of the Noahic age? A man named Nimrod came to power. And the Bible said in the book of Genesis, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Now, we talked about the Tower of Babel. What does that symbolize? Rebellion against who? Whose rebellion? Man's rebellion in general, but more particularly, who does the Bible indicate, and who does history tell us was behind the construction of the tower? The Bible implies it. History tells us out and out. Who commanded its construction? Nimrod. Okay? Now, the Bible doesn't directly state that, but it does imply it, and it is a recorded thing in not church history, but ancient Israeli history. So the government ultimately rebelled against God, and absolute power corrupts. Someone finish the statement for me.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Okay, that's where Nimrod got to be. Like Pharaoh after him and the Roman emperors, what does history tell us about Nimrod? What did he declare himself to be? A god. Isn't that what most of those ancient kings eventually did? If they got enough power, they let it go to their head. Who does that remind you of? Think but way before Pharaoh. Think of God's original great enemy, Satan. Power goes to people's heads, and they are corrupted by that power, and they rebel against God. So the purpose behind the flood age was, just as the Adamic age showed us that conscience can't save us, the flood age and its aftermath showed us that the government cannot save us. That's where people are at today. They want to put all of their trust in the state. They want to trust the state to take care of us for our health. They want to trust the state to take care of us for education. They want to trust the state to take care of us for any and all number of things. But the state, even if it's a good government, cannot solve the problems of the world, nor can the state save the soul of man. Even today, do we have examples of Nimrod-like things going on today and Pharaoh-type things going on today? This is the modern world. You would think that kind of thing's not going on, but who knows what it's like in North Korea right now? All right. Anybody ever seen those giant gold statues of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il or whatever it is there in Pyongyang? If you ever watch videos of the North Korean capital, most people do not have cars. But when they are riding their bicycles past that statue, guess what every citizen does? He gets off his bicycle and walks with his head lowered. And if he approaches the statue, guess what they have to do? They have to get down and bow to it. What does that sound like? Who remembers Nebuchadnezzar? Okay? These are not things that are just in the Bible. These are things that we continue to see in the modern day when absolute power is allowed to go unchecked. Any human government is going to be composed of humans. That's the key word in human government. There are no perfect people. And so that was the point of the end of the Noahic age, was to show us the insufficiency of government. So what did God do to start out the Abrahamic age? What did we discuss in the second part of the class last week? This should be easy. Why is it called the Abrahamic age? He called out Abraham. What was his original name?
Abraham.
All right. Now, look at your map there. I'll turn this around for the online students to watch. Brother Christian, where did Abraham or Abram come from? And where was that at? Do you know? You're the Bible geography teacher, so I'm going to put you on the spot. It's not on this map. At least I could not find it. I know the general area.
Yeah.
There it is. There it is. Right down here. Now, how is it that this is called the Fertile Crescent? It's because this is nothing but desert right here. The fertile lands are...
Where the rivers are.
Exactly. So God called out Abram here. Did he immediately obey God?
No.
No. What did he do?
He went halfway.
He went halfway. And he didn't just go halfway geographically. He went halfway geographically because he went to Haran. But in what other ways did he just halfway obey God?
He kept his family.
He kept his family. He was commanded to leave his father's house. Who was his father?
Terah.
Terah. Very good. What was Terah? Terah was alive when Abram was commanded to leave. The Bible tells us that Terah was an idolater. Okay? So there's a reason God said, get out of your family. He was also told to leave everybody behind except his wife. Who did he bring with him? He brought Lot. So the first thing we see about Abram is that despite being called Father Abraham, despite being the father of the faith in the sense of being the father, the Bible says, of all them that believe, despite probably being the most faithful man in the Bible, the epitome of faithfulness, we see that he started out very much like the rest of us. Amen? Someone who had a lot of growing to do. Now, the lesson for us in that is this. These men in the Bible, like Abraham, are not exceptions. We can be as faithful as Abraham. We just have to recognize that it takes a growing process. Amen? Abraham did not become Father Abraham overnight. Okay? It is perfectly possible for us to be faithful like Abraham, but it takes growing in the faith. We discussed that when he finally did get to the promised land, we saw on more than one occasion there was a famine. Now, where did God tell Abraham or Abram to dwell? Do what?
He went down to Egypt.
He went down to Egypt, but did he do so at God's command? No. God never commanded Abraham to go down there to Egypt. God had commanded him to stay in the land of Canaan. And what was the result of, remember we talked about faith failures. What's a faith failure? Let's give a couple of examples of faith failure from the New Testament. All right, so Jesus was crossing the Sea of Galilee. He was in the boat. His disciples, well acquainted with the Sea of Galilee, were running the ship. Jesus was asleep in the back of the boat, and all of a sudden there come up a storm. The disciples, they were fishermen, right? So if they were scared of the storm, having, lived their lives on the water, what does it tell us about the storm, that they're afraid of it? It was a doozy. Jesus is still in the back of the boat, sleeping like a baby. The disciples run back there, wake him up, and say, Lord, save us, we're about to perish. What did how did he respond? In one of the Gospels, he responded with the words, how is it that you of little faith, is what he said. Oh, you of little faith. In another version, I think it was Mark's, he said, how is it that you have no faith? Now, was Jesus saying they weren't saved? Well, I thought we were saved by faith. How can you be saved if you have no faith? What's the answer? What's it say in Romans 1:1? Anybody remember? Let's go there. Romans 1:1. And look at, someone read verse 17.
For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith.
All right, notice those words, from faith to faith. We need saving faith in order to be saved, amen? But we need living faith in order to live a righteous life for God. We need to continue to trust God. Jesus was basically saying, how is it that you have no living faith? We can't be godly people and we can't be faithful people unless we trust the Lord. Here's another example from the New Testament of a faith failure. Jesus said that he was going to be arrested and be crucified. What did Peter say the first time Jesus talked about that? He says, no, you won't. And his implication was, I'm not going to what? I'm not going to let it happen. Now, Jesus said something I'd hate to hear. I'd hate to hear it from anybody, especially from the Lord. What did he say to Peter? Get thee behind me, Satan. Because the devil was influencing Peter to say that, trying to stop Jesus from going to the cross. Now, the next time Jesus said what was going to happen, what did Peter do then? That was a faith failure on Peter's part. What's Peter's next big faith failure? And once again, in relation to Jesus being arrested. Think of the night of the Lord's Supper, the first Lord's Supper. What did Peter vow he was going to do? I'll go to prison for you. I will die for you. And Jesus said to him, Peter, before this night is over with, you're going to deny me 3 times. Talk about a faith failure. 3 different times that night, Peter denied knowing Jesus, and then the cock crew, what did he do afterwards? The Bible tells us. He went and wept. Not just wept, the Bible says he wept bitterly.
That was misplaced faith, wasn't it?
Well, it was pride, misplaced faith in himself, for sure. I would say as far as it being in himself, yes, absolutely. But it was spiritual pride, and he was utterly crushed by what he did. Now, he's a saved man. Just because we have faith failures doesn't mean we lose our salvation. But when we have a faith failure, there's two things that are going to come from it. One, hopefully we will learn from the experience and do better in the future. But also, there's going to be consequences for our faith failures. So let's go back to Abram. Abram had a faith failure. Instead of trusting God, he decided to go down into Egypt. Well, when he was there, all of a sudden he was afraid that his wife was going to be taken by the Egyptians because she was so beautiful. So he told a half-truth. And a half-truth is what we call a lie. Anything meant to deceive is a lie, whether it's technically true or not. I always hate it when lawyers say yes or no on the stand. Yes or no, yes or no. You shouldn't be forced into just saying yes or no. Anytime someone answers a question, they should be allowed to explain their answer, because you can take a yes or a no and you can twist it to mean something completely different from what it is. Is that your sister? The technical answer was what? Yes, but it was his half-sister, and in ancient Mesopotamian culture, it was perfectly acceptable for a man to marry his half-sister. Okay, we view that as ridiculous today. We even view that as gross today, but it was perfectly normal in the culture at the time. Now, not only did he wind up with his wife being basically taken prisoner for Pharaoh's harem, God delivered him out of that, but who did he wind up getting while he was there? Who wound up coming into his household because of Abraham's sin of going down there to Egypt? Hagar. All right? So, who came from Hagar? Who came from Ishmael that we're dealing with today? Yeah, the Arabs, to be more precise. So, Abram's sin, Abram's faith failure had long-term consequences. Do our sins have long-term consequences? Are there sins we commit in our youth that affect our days in our old age? Absolutely. Are there things that we do as fathers or mothers that affect our children or our spouses? Absolutely. So we learn from the study of Abram's life that even people who turn out to be the most godly of people are still human beings. There is still a growing process. All right, so let's talk about the meaning of Abram's name. Let me find I'll just have to, let's see, file. Oh, the TV is not even on. Let me see if I can get this thing on real quick. All right. Not only that, but there we go. There it is. I'm not even seeing the computer. Are y'all? It's hooked up. It's not 3. This thing's just all messed up today. Well, I guess I can't put it up there until we figure out the technical difficulty, so I'll just...
I assume you've got it plugged up to your computer?
I do.
Maybe just try unplugging it, plugging it back in. Let's see if it pops up on your inputs.
There it is. All right. So let's go to design, add our page color to All right. So the name Abram. What did we say it meant? Very good. High Father. Why was this an ironic name?
Because he wasn't a father.
Because he was not a father. Okay? Now, God ultimately changed his name to Abraham. And that name means father of multitudes or father of many. Another ironic name. Imagine going around saying, "What's your name?" It's High Father. How many kids you got? I got a person in Wichita. His nickname for me, since I have 7 kids, was Chief. Now, why did he call me Chief? I got a tribe. He says, I speak for my people. I hit a deer with the van, and then I went from chief to chief great hunter. Now, that would be an ironic name if I, hadn't hit a deer with the church van and if I didn't have a bunch of kids, because I don't hunt. And if I didn't have a tribe to go with the name, people would wonder, well, what's that name? But that's how people viewed Abraham. And then Abram, and then God says, well, not just that, I'm going to change the name from Abram to Abraham, meaning the father of multitudes. So let's go ahead and review the actual covenant that God made with Abraham. Go with me to Genesis chapter number 12. It says in verse 1, Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all the families, or all the nations of the earth be blessed. What is the great nation that was ultimately made of Abraham? Israel. Now here's the amazing thing. That nation is still around today. It was on a 2,000-year hiatus, but is there any other country that existed 2,000 years ago that has ever come back into existence in one day? What does that say about the providence of God? What does it say about the people who refuse to believe in God and refuse to believe in the Bible, that the primary nation of the Bible is the one and only nation that has survived all these years? And that is still protected by God today, and that is still, even as we speak, at the center of world events. Y'all remember when we talked about how Jesus was the most important and influential person ever born? Even if you don't want to be a Christian, you have to admit, if you have an open mind, that there has never been a human being on earth who had as much influence as Jesus did. Okay? So, when we consider the, what's the word I want to use? The providential influence of Christ and the providential influence of Israel, to me, that's one of the reasons why it's the fool who said in his heart, there is no God. So, getting back to Abraham, the nation that was established through him was ultimately Israel. First you had Isaac, then you had Jacob, and Jacob's name was changed to Israel. When it says, I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, what does that mean?
Those that help you, I'll bless them. But those who go against you, I'll curse them.
Why is it, how many bad things does America have going on, and has America had going on since the 1940s?
Oh, a lot.
A lot, okay? Since the 1940s, we have been a nation permeated by sexual sin. We've been a country permeated by gambling and drugs. We've been a nation that has tolerated paganism and witchcraft and black magic, homosexuality, divorce. I can go on and on and on with the wickedness that America has allowed and tolerated, and yet God has continued to bless us as a nation. Why?
We support Israel.
Because we have supported Israel all that time. Let's look at another example. This is from the Bible. Let's look at Egypt. As long as Egypt blessed Joseph and blessed the nation of Israel within its borders, did God bless Egypt? Yeah. Why was Egypt spared? The worst famine in history. Because of the Israelites. So as long as Israel was blessed by Egypt, God blessed Egypt. Even though Egypt was a nation of sexual immorality, a nation of idolatry, a nation of black magic. I go on with the evil things that were going on with Egypt, but God still blessed them because they blessed Abraham, because they blessed Jacob, because they blessed Joseph. What happened to Egypt when they turned on Israel? What ultimately happened to Egypt? What did God do to that country?
He destroyed them.
He utterly destroyed them. Okay? He took the most powerful country on earth at the time and he humbled it to the ground. What happened to, let's go through these countries. The Assyrians. Yes. Ultimately, they were wiped out. All right? Had they been someone who hurt God's people? God used them to chastise Israel, but guess what? Just because God uses a nation to chastise Israel doesn't mean that nation's not going to pay the price for turning on God's people. What about Babylon, which took the southern kingdom? Gone. What about Haman, who tried to kill all the Jews? He and his whole family wound up on the scaffolds themselves. What has happened to every nation that has turned against the Jewish people? They've ultimately been destroyed. And I am afraid, I was talking to Joe about this just today, the generation of people coming up right now in America, they hate Israel. They utterly hate Israel. This modern Generation Z and a lot of the millennials, but mostly this new generation coming up, they hate Israel. I mean, they're walking around supporting Palestine. I could not imagine such a thing 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. This country was very much a pro-Israel nation and a pro-God nation. But because of liberalism, because of leftism, because of secularism and various other evil things, people are being turned against Israel, and they're supporting the terrorists who here read about what or saw on the news what these terrorists did to the babies in Israel? You did or you did?
Recently?
Yeah, recently. Yeah, they killed, they beheading babies, Brother Christian, and stuff like that. It was horrible. Okay, so these people are going into Israel and beheading babies and killing innocent men, women, and children. And we have people in America who are cheering on the Palestinians.
My goodness.
Okay. Continuing with the prophecy upon Abraham, I'll bless those that bless thee, curse thee that curse thee. And what does it mean when it says, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed? What is that a prophecy of? Very good. Talking about the fact that Jesus Christ would come from Abraham. Now, who did Abraham, getting back to unintended consequences of faith failures, who did Abraham bring with him? Lot. Did that have unintended consequences? Yes, because Lot wound up in Sodom. And after that whole fiasco, he ended up living in a cave, being intimate with his daughters, although he was drunk. He didn't do it intentionally, but there's your lesson on the dangers of being intoxicated. And the people that came out of Lot, we're still dealing with the people that it's a combination of Ishmael's descendants, Lot's descendants, and Esau's descendants that cause all the problems today. So we're still dealing with the fallout from those sinful decisions on the part of Abraham. All right. Let's talk about the battle of the nations. Go to chapter 14 of Genesis. I want someone to read verses 1. Let's see, it's a long passage, but let's just go ahead and break it into segments and discuss it. So, verses 1 through 4, somebody.
Chapter 14?
Chapter 14, verses 1 through 4.
And it came to pass in the days of Amphriel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Eleazar, Chuladamor, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shindab, king of Adamah, and Shimber, king of the
Zeboim.
and the king of Bela, which is Zor.
Okay. Anthony, you awake, buddy? All right, let's go back to our map. I'm going to turn the map around so that the all right. So here's the military situation. You've got Lot living down here where the Dead Sea is at today, so that would be the area of Sodom and Gomorrah. And you have these kings from different areas. So you've got Amraphel, king of Shinar. That would be this area over here where Babylon is at. And then you've got Chedorlaomer. I don't know where Elisar is, but I know that Tidal, king of nations, is talking about Tidal, king of the Goim, or the king of the Gentiles. So that would indicate some Jachathites from somewhere over in this area. So you basically have this confederacy of kings that come down and make war with the cities of Sodom, Gomorrah, and the other small cities. Now, the way politics worked in those days was the more powerful countries would demand tribute from those countries that were weaker. So, Brother Christian here and Brother Joe, they're both kings of their own cities, okay? But I command an empire that's quite larger than you. So I come down with my army and surround your city, and I come up and I say, tribute. Who here ever saw the movie The 300? Okay? Do you remember the Persian guy that showed up at Sparta and walked in and asked for earth and water? Okay, why did he want that? He wanted a sign of Sparta's submission to Xerxes. Now, in that case, Brother Christian, they picked the wrong city to pick on. Brother Joe, do you remember what happened then? The famous "This is Sparta" scene, and they kicked the guy off into the pit. But in this instance, Sodom and Gomorrah and Zoar and these little cities, they had decided they were going to pay tribute to these more powerful countries until they got tired of doing it, and then they rebelled. So they rebelled, and so to teach them a lesson, they come down with their armies, and you have 4 kings. It's called the Battle of Armies. It's 4 kings with 5. Now, Lot had pitched his tent towards Sodom. Y'all remember how we discussed last week that you start out looking at Sodom, and the next thing you know, you're actually living inside of Sodom. We talked about how Abraham, as a man of faith, the book of Hebrews tells us he dwelt in tents with Isaac and with Jacob. So he was a man who was more concerned with the city of God, more concerned with the world to come than he was with the present world. Lot, on the other hand, was a materialistic guy. All he could consider was the status of getting to live in those cities, the wealth that would come from being able to live in those cities, the prestige that would come with being able to live in those cities. He had no regard whatsoever, number one, for the kind of people he was going to be exposing his daughters to. We saw how that ended, right? With his daughters committing sexual fornication with him, getting him drunk later. Where was Lot's trust at? Remember, what surrounded these cities? In those days, what did you build around a city? A wall. All right? So from an earthly standpoint, you look at that city and you think protection. And yet, who wound up being carried away captive? Was it Abraham, who lived out there in the fields and the tents, or was it Lot, who lived inside the walls? It was Lot. So when we place our trust in man, we very often find out that man cannot cannot protect us. So Lot gets carried away. That's basically what happens. And you jump down there to verse 14, or verse 13. It says, "And there came one that had escaped, and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram." When it says they were confederate with Abram, it just means they were allies with him. So you've got basically Abraham and two other guys that live out there in the land with tents and flocks and so forth. And it says, "And when Abraham heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan." Now, are these professional soldiers?
Said they're trained.
It says they're trained, but they are also just his servants, right? I mean, like, we've got men who are trained in the militia or the National Guard, but that doesn't make them like frontline soldiers, okay? So you've basically got the equivalent of the ancient National Guard chasing after a much larger professional army. Now, look at the strategy that is used here. Who's ever heard of Stonewall Jackson? One of the most famous generals in history. During the Civil War, he actually used the Bible to teach his commanders strategy. He would actually order his commanders to study books like Genesis and 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings to develop their battle strategies. And Joshua is filled with military strategy. So look at what he did here. Verse 15, "And he," what's it say he did? He divided himself against them. Now, most military commanders will say, you never divide your forces in the face of the enemy. And yet, we see that Abraham did this, and when we look at the Civil War, we see that Stonewall Jackson did this at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Notice what else he did here. It says, "And he divided against them and his servants by" what? By night. Whether we're talking in the ancient days of the Bible or whether we're talking about in the Civil War, why did they not fight at night usually? You can't see. Not only that, how can the generals command the battle? Keep in mind, whether it's Abraham's day or Stonewall Jackson's day, we don't have field radios like in World War II. We don't have modern communications equipment. How did they communicate? Flags, smoke signs, or having a courier carry a message. Now, if I'm going to send a message, let's say that we're generals, Brother Joe, and I've set you over a certain section of the battlefield, the only way I can communicate with you is if I give a message to Lieutenant Christian here and say, ride this over to General Joe and tell him do this or do that. If it's nighttime, what are the chances of him finding you? Pretty tough, all right? So the point I'm making here is that Abraham is not trusting to human wisdom. And in the same way, godly Christian men like Stonewall Jackson did not trust to worldly wisdom, but rather trusted in the Lord. So here's basically what happened. At both the Battle of the Kings and in the modern Battle of Chancellorsville, which is I say modern, but Civil War era, close enough, much closer to our day than the Bible days. Got to remember to wipe this thing off. This falls right in line with what Brother Scarlett used to say, Christian. Brother Scarlett used to say the Bible is not a history book, but it is what? Historically accurate. The Bible is not a science book, but it is scientifically accurate. The Bible is not a military book, but it is militarily accurate. So here's the basic scenario. You have a very big army. I'm going to draw it as like a big battle line, okay? Abraham has got a very small army. Now, if he just went up to him in the middle of the day with flags flying, what would happen? Yeah, he'd be surrounded and destroyed. What is the benefit of dividing his forces into two? He's already outnumbered, but now he's going to divide himself in two. Stonewall Jackson did the same thing in the face of the Yankees during the Civil War. What can you now do? You can split up. You can attack from this direction, and you can attack from this direction. What happens because you attack at night? What can the enemy not tell?
Which way to come out?
How many?
How many? There you go. They have no idea how many there are. So, at the Battle of the Kings in the Bible, and in the Battle of Chancellorsville in the American Civil War, you had situations where much smaller armies were able to attack a much larger army, and because they attacked from multiple different directions, they gave the appearance of being a much larger force. And because they attacked at night, there was no way for the enemy to know about it. And so it actually says they chased them all the way to Damascus. So picture this. You have got this giant army being chased by a small band of Abraham's men and his buddies all the way back to Damascus, which is right here. So he chased them from here all the way back up to there. So a small group of men had a much larger group of men on the run. And as a result, I know it's time for a break, but I want to finish this. As a result, Abraham returned with Lot and his family, and with all those people who were captured by these five invading kings, as well as all the goods that had been ransacked from Sodom and Gomorrah. And what we'll see here is that the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, specifically the king of Sodom, they come out and they meet Abraham returning from the battle. So look at verse 17. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him, talking about Abraham after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer. That kind of lets me know Abraham and his men killed a bunch of those guys. Because the other thing was they were not expecting an attack at night. Okay? So he comes back with all these things, and let's see. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. Now let's talk about Melchizedek. I believe that Melchizedek was Jesus Christ himself in the pre-incarnate form. Salem, some people try to say, well, that's talking about Jerusalem, okay? The problem is there's no evidence that Jerusalem existed at this point. As a matter of fact, later, when Abraham offers up Isaac, where does he offer him up at? Anybody remember? The mountain of Moriah. All right, a mount in that area. Now, the Jews believe that to be the Temple Mount. A lot of Christians like me believe that it's talking about Calvary. But the point is, in Abraham's day, the area of Jerusalem is not a city. It's just a group of hills out in the middle of nowhere. So why is Melchizedek called the king of Salem? Well, what does Salem mean? The book of Hebrews tells us. Peace. And Jesus is the Prince of Peace. So when you read that Melchizedek, king of Salem, came out, it just means Melchizedek, king of peace, a title of Jesus, came out. He has bread and wine. Now, what is the bread and the wine?
His body and blood.
There you go. It's a picture of the elements of the Lord's Supper. And we also have the fact that Abraham, what does he pay? He pays a tithe. All right, we're going to freeze here and let you take a break, and then we're going to talk about tithing, and we're going to finish talking about Melchizedek. So take a little break. All right, so we're back. So Melchizedek, king of peace, who I believe to be a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, he shows up and he blesses Abraham with the elements of the Lord's Supper. And Abraham's response is to pay him a tenth or a tithe. This is the first instance we have in the Bible of tithing. All right? Now, did Abraham pay tithes to anyone before this? That we know of. No. Did he pay any tithes to anybody after this that we know of?
No.
No. Okay? Was he required to do this, or did he do it of his own free will? He did it of his own free will. All right? So, what do most modern preachers who preach on tithing, what do they say the Bible requires? 10% of your what? 10% of your earnings. Specifically, they're talking about money, aren't they? Okay? And I've even heard them go to the Old Testament books of, is it Malachi, where God says you'll be cursed if you don't tithe, or you rob me in tithes and offerings. Okay? We're going to see whether or not that is applicable to us under the New Testament today. First of all, there was not one tithe under the Old Testament. That's the first thing that has to be understood. As far as I know, and unless you can think of another one, there were three. You had the tithe to support the Levites, you had the tithe to support the poor, and you had a special tithe for a special celebration, a special festival that was being held. All right? So let's look at these various scripture references. Numbers 18, 23 through 26.
Genesis.
Yes, no, Numbers. Numbers 18, 23 to 26.
You want to read it?
Please.
The Levites shall do the service of the tabernacle of the congregation, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that among the children of Israel they have no inheritance. But the tithes of the children of Israel, which they offer as an heave offering unto the Lord, I have given to the Levites to inherit. Therefore I have said unto them, among the children of Israel they shall have no inheritance. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Thus speak unto the Levites, and say unto them, When ye take of the children of Israel the tithes which I have given you from them for your inheritance, then ye shall offer up an eve offering of it for the Lord, even a tenth part of the tithe.
All right. So there was a special tithe for the support of the Levites and the support of the priests. And I'm trying to remember it. Maybe it's going to be, let me see. There was a place where it actually said if you converted your tithe to money, you actually had to pay interest on it, basically. It was just supposed to be of agricultural products. Let me look under my, here. All right, look at Leviticus 27:32. And we'll back up to verse 30. It says, And all the tithe of the land, whether the seed of the land or the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord. And if a man will at all redeem aught of his tithes, he shall add thereto the fifth part thereof. So what does that mean? If it's passing under the rod, it's talking about the animals that are being being counted. Okay? In other words, if I own 10 sheep, how many do I have to give to the Levites? 1. All right? So if I say, Brother Christian, I don't want to give you my sheep, so I'm going to give you money instead. Do I just give you the price of the sheep? What does it say? I got to give more, okay, if I'm going to convert it to money. That's the next thing that I wanted you to see, all right? So, tithing in the Old Testament had nothing to do with money. Do you remember when the Lord was talking to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and he said, you tithe mint and julep, and you omit the weightier matters of the law, talking about them straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. Why was Jesus getting on to them for tithing mint and julep? All right, so the tithe was supposed to be of agricultural products, animals and your crops. Do Pharisees and Sadducees have crops?
No.
Do they have animals?
No.
No. So here's what they had. They had herb gardens, kind of like how my dad will grow herbs in his backyard, or some people will grow it in their windowsill. So they viewed that as their harvest. So they take a tenth of their mint and a tenth of their julep, and then they give that and say, look what we've done. We've given a tenth to the Lord, okay? They might have plenty of money, but they're not going to give that to anybody because they're not required to do so under the law. They're required to give their agricultural produce. So Jesus was basically mocking them, and rightly so, for bragging about the fact that they paid their tithes. Remember the guy that stood up in the temple and said, I tithe of all that I want, all that I possess. So you have this one tithe of 10% that goes to support the Levites. Then you have another one that goes to support the poor. Look at Deuteronomy 14:28. We'll back up just a little bit. This is actually the tithe for the, not for the poor, but for that festival that I was telling you about. So it says, starting in verse 22. Someone read verse 22 and 23.
Thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed, and the field bringeth forth year by year. And thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there. The tithe of thy corn, of thy wine, and of thine oil, and the firstlings of thy herds, and of thy flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always.
Okay, so this is a special festival that's held every year. And they're required to save up 1/10 of their agricultural produce, be it their crops or their animals, to have this festival. It's kind of like what we do today. If I'm going to get my kids any Christmas at all, what do you think I have to do with my number of kids and my level of income? Do what?
A little bit at a time.
A little bit at a time all year long. We save up so that we'll have the money at the end of the year to be able to get the kids Christmas. So that's basically what this is. You're going to save up so that you can take part in this festival. Everyone's going to go to this spot that the Lord chooses. And this is not the same as the tithe that was given to the Levites. You have a tithe of 10% given to the Levites. Now we've got another 10% that's being saved up for this festival. So how much tithing are they doing now? It's not just 10%, it's what? 20%. All right? So they save up for this festival. It says in verse 24, and if the way be too long for thee, so that thou art not able to carry it, or if the place be too far from thee, which the Lord thy God shall choose to set his name there, when the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, then shalt thou turn it into money, and bind up the money in thine hand, and shalt go unto the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. Now in this instance, they don't have to add the fifth part, because it's simply a matter of you can't get to the place with all the stuff you're supposed to, so turn it into money. Now, what do they spend the money on? Someone read the next few verses. Read verse 26 to us.
And thou shalt bestow that money for whatsoever thy soul lusteth after, for oxen or for sheep, or for wine, or for strong drink, or for whatsoever thy soul desireth. And thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice there and thine household.
There you go. So basically, take the money to this place that I've chosen, God says, for the festival. Buy whatever you want. Buy sheep and eat them. Buy strong drink and drink it. Go down there and have a what? Have a good old time, because who are they supposed to be celebrating? Supposed to be celebrating the Lord. So there's your second tithe. The other tithe, I'm trying to find it, is the poor man's tithe. I believe that's 26. It's somewhere in Deuteronomy. Try 26:12. Let's see if that's the one I'm looking for. This was a tithe that wasn't taken every year. It was taken every other year or every third year. So,
Verse 12,
is it? Let's see.
chapter 26.
When thou hast made an end of tithing all the tithes of thine increase the third year, which is the year of tithing, and hast given it unto the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that they may eat within thy gates and be filled. So you have every year you're paying 20%, 10% for the Levites, 10% for the or 10% for the priest, 10% for the I keep wanting to say the fair, the festival that we just talked about. And then you have this additional one for the Levites and for the widows and the strangers. We would basically call that taxing people to take care of the poor. So if we were to tithe today according to the Old Testament, and when God said, you've robbed me in tithes and offerings, what kind of tithes and offerings was he talking about? What we're reading about here, okay? Because who are you robbing? You're robbing God if you're an Israelite and you don't tithe. You are robbing God, but who else are you robbing? Well, what's one of the main purposes of the tithe? You're supposed to use it to feed God's men, and you're supposed to use it to feed the widows and the orphans. So if you're not paying your tithe, it's like not paying your taxes. You're basically letting God's men go hungry, and you're letting the poor children and widows and so forth go hungry. So tithing was not putting 10% of your money in an offering plate. All right? Let's look at some scriptures that are used in the modern day to preach tithing under the New Testament. Look at, let's see. This is one of those scriptures that I've heard modern day Baptist preachers use to try to say that we're supposed to be tithing under the New Testament. Okay? Someone read Matthew 23:23.
It says, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone.
All right, so a Baptist preacher stands up and he tells his people, open up to Matthew 23:23, and he reads this in the hearing of his people, and this is the conclusion that he draws. He says, Jesus did not condemn tithing. Jesus said that there are more important things, but he said you ought not to have left this undone. So make sure you pay your, what? Tithes. Is he being true to the text? Is that applicable based on this text to the New Testament church? Read it very carefully. What does Jesus say tithing is a part of? The law. Are we under the law today? Was he speaking to people who were under the law? Yes. He was talking to people. He had not yet died on the cross. He's talking to people who were under the law, and he specifically says that tithing is part of the law. So if the law has been done away with and nailed to the cross, I know some of our preachers are going to try to burn me at the stake for this. What has been nailed to the cross with it? Tithing. Okay? In the Old Testament sense of the word. This verse in no way teaches New Testament church obligatory monetary Tithing. Let's look at another one there in Hebrews. All right? Trying to use this thing. Here we go. Let's just go to the book of Hebrews. All right, go to Hebrews chapter 7. All right, in Hebrews chapter 7, we're talking about Melchizedek. And let's go ahead and start in verse 1. It says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, or king of peace, prince of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace, without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but is made like unto the Son of God, abideth the priest continually." Does that sound like Jesus? Very much so. All right, now consider this great, how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth part of all. And verily, they that are of the sons of Levi, who receive the office of the priesthood, have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, though they come out of the loins of Abraham. But he whose descent is not counted from them receiveth tithes, or received tithes of Abraham, and blessed him that had the promises. And without all contradiction, the less is blessed of the better. In other words, whoever receives the tithe is more important than the person who gives the tithe. That makes sense, right? The person receiving the tithe is more blessed than the person giving the tithe under the law. And so we get in verse 8 this statement: "Here men that die receive tithes, but there he receiveth them, of whom it is witness that he liveth." So I've heard missionary Baptist preachers stand up and read verse 8. "And here men receive tithes, but there he receiveth them, of whom it is witness that he liveth." And so Hebrews was written during the New Testament, so in the New Testament we're supposed to tithe. Is that what this verse is talking about? What is the here and there that's being spoken of? When the author of Hebrews says, "Here men receive tithes, but there God receiveth them," what is he saying, and what is the purpose of his statement?
He's talking about an Abraham's day.
Do what?
I think he's talking about an Abraham's day.
Okay, he's talking about tithing in the current situation, and tithing back there in the case of Abraham. The whole point of the book of Hebrews is to show that Jesus is better than everything in the Old Testament. Jesus is better than the angels, true or false?
True.
Jesus is better than Moses, true or false?
True.
The sacrifice of Jesus is better than on the cross, is better than the animal sacrifices. True. So here's what's being stated. Jesus' priesthood, the priesthood of Melchizedek, is better than the Old Testament priesthood that these Hebrews are wanting to go back to. What was still in operation when the book of Hebrews was being written? What had not been destroyed and what was still open for business? The temple. The Judaistic religion was still being practiced to its full force. What were the people in the book of Hebrews, thinking of doing? What's the whole book just trying to dissuade them from doing? They're under persecution. It's costing them heavily to follow Christ. So what are they thinking about doing? Giving up and going back to Judaism. Now, that would mean going back to that temple system and paying tithes to the Levites, which they were not doing. They're considering going back and doing it. Now, to show them that you would be going back to something inferior, the author of Hebrews is saying, when you follow Jesus, Melchizedek is your priest. And back then, when Abraham gave a tithe to Melchizedek, he was giving it directly to God. And so today, if you were to give a tithe to the Levites, you would just be giving it to men and not to God. So it's simply showing the superiority of Melchizedek or Jesus over the priesthood of the Levites. That was the whole argument that was being made. And even here, it says in verse 5, according to the what? According to the law. And the law is done away with. Now, I've spent all this time trying to blast this false doctrine of forced tithing under the New Testament out of the water. And so some people may be saying, well, Brother BJ, you're just trying to find an excuse not to give money to the Lord. Not at all. The New Testament is always superior to the what? To the Old Testament. Amen?
Amen.
Always superior. So let's look at some situations in the Old Testament. Who remembers the widow's mite? What did she do, the widow that gave her mite? What was so significant?
She gave
All that she had. All these other people were making this big deal about all the money they were casting into the offering plate, and this poor woman comes in and gives a mite or 2 mites or whatever it is. And I'm sure there were people who looked at her and mocked, what a cheap giver. And Jesus said she gave more than all of them because she of her poverty gave
From my heart.
everything that she had. Let's look at the book of Acts. Did they give a tenth in the book of Acts? No. How much did they give, Brother Christian, in the book of Acts? Not because they were required to, but how much did people give in the book of Acts voluntarily? Ananias and Sapphira got struck dead for lying about it.
I want to say it was all.
Everything. They sold their house. They sold their lands. They gave the proceeds to the apostles. They laid it at the apostles' feet. So under the Old Testament, it was give your 25%. I mean, let's be honest. If we're going to follow the Old Testament, if you're going to say we have to tithe under the Old Testament system, you have to give not 10%, but 25%. And you also got to spend 10% of that 25% or whatever it was every year on a big party for the Lord. All right, so imagine saving up 1/10 of your income and spending every last bit of it in 1 week and at a celebration. Okay? Do we teach that? Do the preachers who teach you're supposed to be tithing, do they do that? No, they don't. So what are they doing from a Bible analysis standpoint? They're picking the part of the Bible that they want to preach, and they're ignoring the part of it that they don't. I'm not telling you not to give to the church. On the contrary, I'm telling you that under the New Testament, you can, of your own free will, give more than 10% by the grace of God. God in the New Testament specifically says that we do not give of necessity. Let's look at that. Second Corinthians 9. Let's go there. 2 Corinthians 9. It says in verse 6, "But this I say, he that soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully." My good friend Brother Marshall Wallace used to say this: you cannot outgive God. And he believed that. You cannot outgive God. He is not going to be put in a situation where you give him more than he gives you. Now, he may not always give it back to you in money in this life, but he'll give it back to you in blessings, and he'll give it back to you in heavenly rewards when you get there. Look what it says in verse 7. Every man according as he what? Purposeth in his heart. What does it mean to purpose in your heart?
The reason for what you do something.
Well, it's talking about the amount. Okay? The New Testament does not fix an amount of 10%. I think, like you said, Brother Christian, 10% is a good starting point under the New Testament. Okay? But what a man or a woman gives to the Lord is between them and the Lord. You purpose it in your heart. And he says in verse number 7, every man according as he purposes in his own heart, let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God love a cheerful giver. Here's something else I used to take heat for, and I'm sure there's going to be some preachers still want to give me heat for it, but I'm going to say it. If you don't want to give it, God doesn't want it. Did you hear that? I believe that. Is that not what this is basically saying? If you don't want to give it, God doesn't want it. Okay? Does God need your money? Does God need my money? What are we basically doing when we give our money then? He has cattle on 1,000 hills. All riches of the world belong unto him. He does not need our money, so why does he encourage us under the New Testament to give? To show our faith, to show our commitment, and so forth. All right? All we're doing when we fail to give is cut ourselves out of a blessing. And listen, I mean, I have no problem preaching to my people that God, the ministry requires money. Okay? When we join a church, part of the church covenant is that we agree to support the ministry. Brother Christian and I have to eat. Okay? My children need a roof over their heads. And the Bible says, thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn. I know that's under the Old Testament, but the New Testament uses it as a example of this. All right? Why don't you muzzle the ox that treads out the corn? Because the laborer is worthy of his hire. If something or someone works, they deserve to receive a living for it. The New Testament says those that preach the gospel should live of the gospel. So, Brother Christian, there's nothing wrong with you and me being paid for what we do. In fact, God says we should be paid. Now, whether they can pay us or not, what are we supposed to do? We work either way. If we have to be like Paul and make tents, guess what? We have to make tents. Just because we're called worthy of a double honor doesn't mean that in this life we'll always receive the double honor. But once again, you will not outgive God. So the Bible under our current day teaches what's called New Testament giving. Under New Testament giving, you give what you purpose in your heart to the Lord. You will not, we're not under the Old Testament where God says, I will curse you, okay, if you don't pay. We're not under that old system where it's do it or else. We're under the New Testament system where God says, do it as you purpose in your heart. And by the way, if your heart is right with God, what are you going to want to do? You're going to want to give. If your heart is right with God, what are you going to give more than you possibly, how much are you going to give? You're probably going to give more than 10%, okay? All right, so we're done with Melchizedek. We're done with, go back here to Genesis. Does everybody understand what we mean when we say that Melchizedek was a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ? Do y'all remember that term Christophany that we used? Okay? This is where we get it from. This is one of the main examples of a Christophany. That would be an appearance of Christ. All right, let's talk about Abraham's next big faith failure. We talked about it a little bit last week. He had Hagar. God gave him the name of Abram, meaning high father, and then later he got the name Abraham, which means father of multitudes, and yet he and Sarah are not having a baby. So, like we do sometimes, Abraham and Sarah decided, well, God just needs our help. Are we guilty of that sometimes? Let's be honest.
Yes.
Anyone give me an example? Are you willing to share anything in your life where you thought God needed you to help out a little bit? I can think of some times in my life where I took things into my own hands. I got a house down there in Hattiesburg when I moved there. And it's almost like the Lord had said no, 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 but I wouldn't listen. And I ended up buying that house. 1 year later, I had to move to Wichita. How hard do you think it was on me, being a pastor with a pastor's income, having to pay rent on a house in Wichita and still pay a house note for 3 years on a house in Hattiesburg? It was not easy. I don't know how I did it, because I'll be honest, I didn't do it. God is the one who did it. My credit ended up getting ruined because while I kept up on my payments, I didn't keep up with them on time. There were a lot of times where I did not have the money to pay my house note on time, and so I'd get behind, and then the Lord provides some money, and I'd catch up, and then I'd fall behind again, and then I'd catch up, and ultimately I was finally able to save the house, or to sell the house. Do you know how much grief I would have been saved if I just listened to the Lord and rented a house in Hattiesburg when I moved there instead of buying a house? Okay, I thought that I knew better than, I didn't think of it that way, but looking at it in hindsight, that was basically what I was doing. I was saying, God, I know better than you did. I want a house and I'm going to buy one. I done learned that lesson. So has anybody else, you ain't got to share anything in particular, but I just want to know, do y'all understand what I'm talking about? God has a plan, and then we say, well, God, I know better than you do. So in this case, it was Sarah's idea. Sarah said, go into my handmaid, go into my slave girl that we got there in Egypt, have a baby with her. What do you think Abraham said? Yeah, I think he readily agreed. And as a result, what happened? Not just the long-term effects. We've already talked about the long-term effects. What was the short-term effects? Did it hurt his marriage with Sarah? Yeah, because even though it was her idea, next thing you know, she's the one who's angry, and who gets the blame? Abraham did. Okay, we live in this perverted modern society where people basically are talking about, who's heard the term the sexual revolution? Okay, the idea of all sexual activity is now considered perfectly fine. All right. I know that we've talked about homosexuality, but here's another one. How many people today are doing, who's ever heard of the wife swap deal? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now that is supposedly done with the permission of the spouse. Okay. But you know how many marriages get ruined after that happens? Mm-hmm. It's done with someone's okay. It's done with someone's, hey, let's do this. And then after it's done, all of a sudden it was not as, but Satan makes it look so good, and then the next thing you know, the marriage is in total shambles because it's against God's will. It's against God's plan. God intended man to be monogamous. What does that mean? And when I say man, I mean humankind, okay? God intended humankind to be monogamous. What does that mean? One spouse. Okay? Because that kind of love requires 100% devotion to one another. Okay? That is what marriage ultimately is under God, is the total devotion of one man and one woman to each other under the headship of God. And you can't violate that. You can't give permission to your spouse to violate that. It's going to cause problems. And that's what happened in Abraham's family. His relationship with his wife was heavily strained by the fact that he went and had a baby with another woman, even though it was her idea. And then, of course, there were the long-term effects. How did Ishmael treat Isaac when he was born? What's the Bible tell us? When Isaac was weaned, what does the Bible say that Ishmael was doing? Mocking him. Making fun of him. Now, why would 13-year-old Ishmael be mocking his 2 or 3-year-old brother?
Meanness.
Well, meanness, yeah, but meanness usually has some underlying reason. Human depravity is one of them, but usually there's even more to it. There's more to it than that.
He was jealous.
He was jealous. There you go. That's exactly right, because he was the numero uno for Abraham. But now, old Sarah's done gone and had a baby, so now Isaac's going to be the one who is going to be Dad's favorite. Who could see problems down the road with that? So how did God handle it? He handled it through Sarah. He gave Sarah the idea, but then God appeared to Abraham and he said, you listen to your wife Sarah. What did Sarah say to do after she caught Ishmael mocking Isaac? Send him away. And Abraham didn't want to do it. But God said, you do it, and I will take care of him. God even told Abraham, he said, because Ishmael is your son, I will bless him for your sake. Would you say that the Muslim people or the Arab people have been blessed by God in many different ways? Yeah, they have. And I take a little bit different stance than some people on Arabs being in the promised land. Let me show you something neat. Go to Genesis chapter number 16. All right, so this is back when Sarai had been being mean to Hagar, and she ran away into the desert. And the Lord appeared unto Hagar. In verse 11, the angel of the Lord said unto her, behold, thou art with child, thou shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. He will be, what kind of man will he be?
Wow.
Is that the Arabs today? Very much so. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand will be against him. Could that definitely be said of the Arabs today? Have the Arabs fought the Russians? Yeah. Have they fought the Americans? Have they fought the Israelis? Have they fought each other? Yeah, they've always been at odds with people, okay? But look at the last thing that's said in verse 12. This is something Baptist preachers often overlook. He will dwell in the presence of all his brethren. I got news for Israel. They're going to be dealing with the descendants of Ishmael forever. Are the descendants of Ishmael the same as the Canaanites that God commanded to be destroyed? No. That's a mistake that I think sometimes we make. I mean, I've even done it myself, not thinking. I've said things like this. If Israel had just listened to God and killed all those wicked Canaanites like they were supposed to, they wouldn't be dealing with the problems they are today. But is that true? Because who are the people they're dealing with today descended from? Ishmael and Lot and Esau, all of whom are descended from, well, not Lot's people, but or at least either descended from or related to Abraham. Okay? So, yeah, the Middle East, Jews are going to have to share the Middle East with the descendants of Ishmael for forever because they were brought about because of Abraham's mistake. All right, let's see. When Isaac, let's talk about how Isaac was born. Let's go to the book of Genesis, And we're going to pick up in chapter... Let's actually look at the Abrahamic covenant revisited, and then starting in the next period, we'll look at Sodom and Gomorrah. Chapter 15, verse 1. Someone go ahead and read verse 1.
It says, After these things the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am the shield and thy exceeding great reward.
Very good. All right, Brother Christian, if you were to break that down into a sermon, what points would you get out of it? Verse 1. Make me a good Baptist 3-point sermon out of verse 1.
Fear not,
All right, very good. Fear not.
shield, and exceeding great reward.
All right. So, Brother Anthony, take the point, fear not. What should I or Brother Christian preach on this verse under the heading, fear not?
Put itself, fear not, you know.
Well, what would Abraham have to fear?
Oh,
All right, think about his name for a moment. Think about his name. What's his name?
hey,
And that means? And later his name is Abraham, which means?
Father,
And these are ironic names because
He's not a father.
he's not a father. What would he be worried about?
being a father.
Not being a father. Okay? So fear not. God's in control. He says, I am thy shield. Brother Christian, give me what you preach under I am thy shield. What does a shield do? It protects. All right? So what would that statement, how would that apply to Abraham, and how would it apply to us? I am thy shield. I am thy protection. Why would we need protection?
From the enemy.
Satan.
Yeah, the Bible, the New Testament talks about the shield of faith and how we should be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked. And then thy exceeding great reward. Ladies, how should Brother Christian or myself preach that?
Honor God and rewards will be in heaven.
Okay. Well, the point is that God himself is our reward. If we got nothing in heaven at all but to be with God, would that be worth it all? Would that be more than we deserve? Absolutely. Now look at what Abraham's fear is, verse 2. And Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless, and the steward of my house is this Eleazar of Damascus? And Abram said, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thy heir. And he brought him abroad, and said, Look now toward heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it unto him as righteousness. So, later it says, let me find it. This is a different verse. Look at Genesis 22:17, just to get a little bit more of a detail here. Starting verse 15, the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven the second time, said, By myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore. Now, stars are heavenly, right? What is sand?
Earthly.
Abraham has got both a heavenly seed and a earthly seed. Who's the earthly seed? The Jews, the nation of Israel. Who's the heavenly seed?
Jesus.
The believers. Okay, all the believers in Jesus Christ. So, in both Genesis 22 and in Genesis 15, God is promising Abraham a vast number of seed. He says in verse 5, look now toward heaven and tell the stars if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, so shall thy seed be. He believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. Now, even though this is used as an example of salvation by faith in the book of Genesis, is this where Abraham was saved? Remember, we talked about from faith to faith. This is not an example of faith by salvation. This is not an example of when he got saved. This is an example of trusting God to live righteously and live the way that we are supposed to. All right? And he goes on to say, I am the Lord that brought thee out of the Ur of the Chaldees, and to give thee this land to inherit it. So God promised him the land, just like he did back there in chapter 12. It is the title deed to the promised land, as found in the book of Genesis. It belongs to Israel forever. And look at the promise that God made with Abraham. Here's you an example of Abraham still needing to grow in his faith, and of God kind of coming down to our level to identify with us. So someone read verse 8.
Chapter 22.
Of chapter 15. I'm sorry.
And he said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it?
God just told him something. What is Abraham doing?
Question.
He's not just questioning him. What is he implying? Do what? He wants a sign. All right? This is a sign of extreme spiritual weakness on Abraham's part. He's basically asking for a sign. God, how do I know you're telling me? This is basically what he's saying. God, how do I know you are telling the truth? So look what God does. Talk about condescending to man and getting down on man's level. He says in verse 9, take me a heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he took unto him all these, and divided them in the midst. So he takes these big animals, he kills them, he cuts them in half. So let's look at the animals real quick. Someone read them to me one more time out of verse 9, one by one.
Heifer of 3 years old.
All right, so I got my 3-year-old calf. I'm going to kill this calf. I'm going to cut it in half. So I'm going to carry this bloody hind quarter right here, plop it right here. I'm going to carry the head and forward part of this thing, and I'm going to plop it right here. What's the next animal?
She-goat, 3 years old.
Got my she-goat. I'm going to kill the goat. Is this getting messy? I'm going to cut this thing in half. I carry the hind quarter right here, plop it down, and I take the head part, and I put it down right here. What's the next animal?
Ram of 3 years
I take my ram. I kill it. You see what I'm making here? I got my, a dead cow, and then a dead goat, and now I got a dead ram, and I cut each of these animals in half, plotting them here and here. The final should be the turtle doves, right? Or the turtle doves and pigeons?
old. Turtle dove and young pigeon.
Okay, so they're too small to be cut in half. So I kill one, and I put it right here, and I kill another one, and I put it right here. I now have got 4 dead animals, or 5 dead animals, lined up. The next thing that happens is that Abraham has a vision in his sleep. Let's read. He had to wait for a while because the birds, what's going to happen to these carcasses? Do what?
Attract the scavengers.
They're attracting the scavenger. So all these birds are coming down on my dead animals there, and Abraham's having to chase them away to make sure that they don't get picked away and carried away. It says, and when the sun was going down, verse 12, a deep sleep fell upon Abraham. And lo, a horror. This is like a nightmare that he's having. Okay? A horror, a nightmare of great darkness fell upon him. And he, God, said unto Abraham, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs. What do you think old Abraham was dreaming about in his nightmare? He had a vision of his children being whipped and enslaved in Egypt. How would that make you feel if, you have been promised by God you're going to be the father of a great nation and of many nations? It still hasn't happened yet. You've asked God to show you a sign, and the first thing that happens when you fall asleep is you have a dream of your descendants being tortured and worked to death by the Egyptians. Do you see why it says a horror of great darkness? All right. He said unto Abraham, Know of a surety thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they serve will I, what? Judge. And afterward they shall come out with great abundance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. What does that mean? In the 4th generation, 400 years later, they're going to come back, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Amorite is a generic term for the Canaanites. What does it mean that the iniquity is not yet full?
Because all the evil that they were going to do hadn't been completed.
Okay, all the evil that they're going to do has not yet been completed, but that kind of implies that God is waiting for this evil to be done. Okay, yes, there's a certain amount of evil he's going to tolerate them doing, but the cup of iniquity is basically using up God's patience, using up God's grace period, using up God's long suffering. Is God a long suffering God? Is he a patient God? But does it last forever? What happens when the time of grace has run out? If you have not responded? Wrath. So God was still giving the Amorites or the Canaanites and certain people time to repent. And it came to pass that when the sun came down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. So here's the pieces of the animals that Abraham has cut in half. You've got a smoking furnace, and it was basically something that you carried around with hot coals in it, and you used it to start a fire. You used it to light a lamp. So here is a torch or a lamp, and in the dream, the furnace that fires the lamp and the lamp or the torch together are passing through these pieces. Now, what is being symbolized? Can anyone tell me? What has God done here? Because what did Abraham ask for?
A sign.
A sign. God gave it to him. What is this sign and what does it mean? Do you notice Abraham is not confused at all about what he's doing? Because this isn't something God is something of the Lord. This is something of man that God is condescending to. So let's go back in time to Abraham's time period. Brother Christian, you and I are about to make a sacred agreement. Okay? What's something, you and I are both shepherds like Abraham. Okay? What's some sort of agreement that Father Christian and Father BJ could make, an agreement that we could make that we want to take very seriously? Kind of like when we were kids, we would say, cross your heart and hope to die, stick a needle in your eye, eat a horse manure. We had all these hexes we placed on each other when we were kids if we tattletale. Okay? So what's something a little bit more serious, Brother Christian, that you and I could agree to do? Something real important like share a will. Okay, there you go. Share a will. I'm not going to deny the will to your animals. You're not going to deny the will to my animals. But I'm scared that one day you might be stronger than me and take it away, or you're afraid that one day I'm going to be stronger than you and take it away. So this is our equivalent of cross your heart and hope to die, stick a needle in your eye. Me and Christian, we're going to kill these animals. We're going to line them up, and once it is over, Christian and I are going to walk through these animals. What are we saying as we make this covenant?
We're in agreement. We're in accord.
We're saying if we break this agreement, may this happen to us. Okay? It was something from Abraham's culture. I mean, we're laughing when we say cross your heart, hope to die, stick a needle in your eye. But what were we basically doing as kids when we made each other say stuff like that?
That's we telling the truth.
Well, no, it's not necessarily convince you to tell the truth. It's like this is something bad's going to happen to you if you don't keep the agreement. It's superstition, but it's something that we as kids do. It's something that adults have done. They're binding themselves under a curse. Okay, was what they did in Abraham's day. And so God here is saying, all right, Abraham, you want proof, you want a sign, I'm going to come down, I'm going to go through this human ritual with you, and symbolically, the furnace, which is the supply of fire, is God. That's the supply of life, because what lights the torch?
Fire.
Who gave life to Abraham? God did. So that's the ridiculous picture that's being presented here. Almighty God is making an earthly covenant with a man so that he will have the assurance, Abraham and his baby faith at this point in time, giving him that earthly assurance that, yes, I'm going to do what I promised you I would do. Any questions on that? Y'all kind of, I mean, it's a weird thing, but do you now understand what it means? All right, let's go ahead and take a break. All right, we're back for our final period of class number 13. Genesis chapter number 18. I kind of got some of my stuff out of order, but that's okay. We're looking at chapter number 18, and we're going to start in verse 1. It says, and the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre. So we're fixing to see another pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. All right? So just like when he appeared to Abraham as Melchizedek, here it is the Lord again. It says, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. Talking about Abraham. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself toward the ground. Does that kind of indicate that Abraham knows who it is he's talking to? Mm-hmm. Very much so. Because what does he call him?
My Lord.
My Lord. If now I have found favor in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant. Let a little water, I pray you, be fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will fetch a morsel of bread, and comfort ye your hearts. After that ye shall pass on, for therefore are ye come to your servant. And they said, so do as thou hast said. Talking about something exciting. He goes on, Sarah, God is coming over for dinner.
So when he says, rest yourselves under the tree, does that indicate that he knows that God's the Trinity? I'm just curious.
Well, he's got 2 men with him that are actually angels. So, I don't know, to be honest, what Abraham knew about the Trinity. I do believe that he recognized this as God. What word were you talking about exactly? Was it ye?
Yourselves.
Yeah, yourselves.
Rest yourselves under the tree.
I've never thought of it as regarding the Trinity since he's got those 2 men with him, but I'm not going to say it's 100% not possible. But you do have three men there, one of them being God. So he's asking them to come and rest, and he goes to Sarah and basically tells her to get to work. He says, Abraham hastened to the tent unto Sarah and said, make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes upon the hearth. So kind of like in our world today, the women get to work in the kitchen and the men get to work at the barbecue, because look what happens next. And Abraham ran into the herd and fetched a calf tender and good, gave it unto a young man, and he hasted to dress it. So the women are cooking in the kitchen, the men are cooking at the barbecue. And he took butter, and back in Abraham's day, butter would have been considered something that's like luxurious. I mean, this is Abraham fixing a feast. Christian, I got a sermon called, I saw it on my list from years ago, is The Sins of Lot's Wife. Now, one of the things I point out in that sermon is when you look at God visiting, or God and the angels visiting Abraham, you got Sarah and Abraham cooking a feast, all right? When the angels go to Sodom, who cooks supper? Lot or Lot's wife? Do what? Lot. Nowhere is Lot's wife to be found when it comes time to cook. What did Lot fix for him? Anybody remember?
Something that was salty.
Unleavened bread. So the angels and God go to Abraham, and Abraham and Sarah and their household fix God a feast. The angels go to Lot's house, and he mixes flour and water and cooks. So butter and milk, the calf, set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat. That's kind of like Abraham standing there like the waiter, right? He's there to make sure anything they need, they get instantly. And they said unto him, Where is Sarah thy wife? And he said, Behold, in the tent. And he said, this is God speaking, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life. What's generally called the time of life? When do our babies usually born? Or at least what time period is associated with birth?
With the lambing time,
It's usually spring, isn't it? Isn't it springtime is usually considered symbolically the time of life? At least that's my understanding of it. Basically, by next spring is basically what God is saying here. And lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age. How old was Abraham and Sarah? You remember?
90s.
A 90-year-old woman and a 100-year-old man. So imagine what they look like. That's what I want you to do. Imagine what they look like. All right? 90 years old and 100 years old. Therefore, Sarah laughed, but how did she laugh? Someone would look at verse 12 and tell me how she laughed. Yeah, within herself. What does it mean within herself? She didn't laugh out loud. She laughed in her heart. After I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? She's basically saying it's a little late for that. And the Lord said unto Abraham, Wherefore did Sarah laugh? Even though she laughed in her mind, even though she laughed in her heart, who was able to hear it?
Jesus.
Can anything be hidden from the Lord?
No.
Not a thing. So, wherefore, or why did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I of a surety bear a child which am old? I love this question. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Now, I want you to think for a moment. After this, and after the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, what happens? Abraham and Sarah go back down into, not down to Egypt, but they go to where the Philistines are staying. And Abraham repeats one of his old lies. Who remembers what it is?
This is my sister.
Why does he say that? Now think for a minute. Why did he do it the first time?
She's beautiful.
Because she's beautiful, and he's scared that Pharaoh's going to take her for his harem. Now he's got the king of the Philistines. All of a sudden, he's worried about the exact same thing. Now think about this. In, what is it, chapter 19 we're in right now?
18.
Chapter 18, okay? Chapter 18, she's so old, she's mocking God in her heart. You know, I'm going to have a baby. I'm going to have pleasure. Yeah, right. It's just a little bit too late for that. But fast forward to chapter 20, and the king of the Philistines looks at her just like Pharaoh looked at her, and he's like, take her for my harem. What has God done if you read between the lines? When I was a kid, all the Sunday school books had a picture of an old granny with a pregnant belly, and then later you had a picture of an old granny holding a baby. Do you think that's what it looked like?
No.
What did God most likely do based on what we're reading? He not just preserved her, he turned the clock back. He made her young enough and healthy enough to be able to conceive, carry, and give birth to a child. That's why just a few weeks later, when she's in Gerar, the king of the Philistines looks at her. Do you think he sees a 90-year-old woman and says, take her for my harem? He sees a beautiful young woman and says, take her for my harem. And he did it because Abraham said that lie again, she's my sister. So that's what I get when I read between the lines. So God basically rejuvenated them enough to be able to have children. All right, so they have the feast, and then God sends the angels to Sodom. And it says in verse 16, the men rose up from thence and looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to bring them on the way. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. This is really an amazing statement when you consider that God is saying, Abraham, I'm so close to you, I don't think it's right for me to hide from you what I'm about to do. Is God in the habit of including men in his plans? Really? I mean, on a regular basis? Or does he normally just say, trust me? And he normally just says, trust me. But in this case, he feels the need to fill Abraham in. It says, for I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him. And the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me, and if not, I will know. And the men turned their faces from thence and went toward Sodom, but Abraham stood yet before the Lord. What do you think the first thing that went through Abraham's mind was when God said, I'm fixing to send my angels to check that place out? I mean, does Abraham know what's going on in that city? Yeah. Do you remember the story where we were at with Melchizedek? I kind of skipped over this part. But Melchizedek told Abraham, he said, you give me my people, but keep all the booty. All right, keep all the loot that you got from, those kings that looted my city. And Abraham refused to do it. He said, my two partners are going to take their share, Ashcol and Aner. But he says, I'm not keeping anything so much as a shoe strap that belonged to you. Why do you think Abraham said that? Who's he talking to? Do you think that he armed his men and chased after those 5 kings because he cared about the king of Sodom and because he cared about those filthy Sodomites? Why did Abraham go after him? Did he want the wealth? He wanted Lot. He wanted to free his nephew. Those other people, they were just blessed because Abraham loved Lot. But he told that filthy king of Sodom, he said, I don't want nothing of yours. I don't want so much as a shoestring that is yours. Because he says, I don't want you walking around saying, I'm the one who made Abraham rich. God is the one who made Abraham rich. And he didn't want anybody else to be able to take God's credit, much less the filthy king of Sodom. Okay? So, yeah, basically Abraham said, I don't want anything that's yours. So Abraham knows what the city of Sodom and Gomorrah is like. And yet, is he concerned about the people there? Yeah, he is. He's not worried about Lot because I think he knows that God will preserve Lot. But he's trying to find a way to talk God into preserving the city. All right, to having mercy. So God said that the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great because their sin is very grievous. Does that sound like all sin is equal? Remember I told y'all about the missionary Baptist preacher I knew Brother Christian, I don't know if you remember Brother, I believe it was Kevin Stewart. Did you ever know Kevin Stewart? All right, so Kevin and I started seminary together in 2007, I guess it was. And he was pastoring Hickory Springs. Is that still down there?
I believe so.
Okay. So he didn't last but maybe a year there as pastor. But the last time I talked to him, he was defending homosexual behavior because what happened was he preached against it until it was his brother or his sister or somebody like that started practicing it. Now, once again, I believe we should love everybody, amen? We should give God's love to everybody. We should try to get everybody saved. But should I say that ungodly activity is okay just because my family's doing it? In fact, what does that make me? If y'all knew that from the pulpit I preached against homosexuality and sexual perversion, but all of a sudden I don't have a sister, so I'll say my sister or one of my kids or something like that, all of a sudden someone in my family starts doing it, and all of a sudden it's okay. What would your opinion of me be? What would that basically make me? A hypocrite, okay? Now, lots of people, that's the way they are. Once it gets close to home, that's when they change their position. I'll give you another one. There's a lot of preachers, there's this debate amongst Baptist preachers, and I guess other Bible-believing Christians, about whether a man who's been divorced should be able to what, Brother Christian? Should a man who's divorced and remarried be allowed to pastor? Okay, that is a big debate amongst our people. Now, I have respect for the men. I disagree with them, but I have respect for the men who say a divorced man cannot remarry. I know a lot of good men, that's their... A divorced man who's remarried cannot pastor. I know a lot of men who teach that, and I love them and I have respect for them, okay? But here's what I don't have respect for. When they change their mind when it happens to them. Or they change their mind when it happens to their son. Okay? Because I've known men who have held the King James Bible and thundered away in the pulpit about how godless it is for a divorced man who's remarried to pastor, and then all of a sudden it comes to them or it comes to their son, and they do a what? They do a 180. Okay? I have never been divorced. Lord willing, I never will be. You know, but for the grace of God, go I there. So something we should all say. It shouldn't be a matter of pride, but I certainly don't envision myself getting divorced anytime. But I'll say this. I openly say, if God has called me to preach and I wind up, in a divorce situation, my wife leaves me or whatever, I'm not going to stop pastoring. And I'm not going to stay unmarried either, because the Bible says that it's not good for the man to be alone. And I don't believe that a man is automatically disqualified from pastoring just because he happens to be divorced. So there's a lot of men, I hope they would respect my position, and I base it on the Bible. That's not what we're talking about right now, but here's the point that I'm trying to make, is that we should not be hypocrites in what we believe. Okay? And that's where this brother I was talking about was at. He said to me that my overeating, I was never exceedingly overweight, but I wasn't exactly thin. But sorry about that, online students. The computer ran out of power. I'm not sure how much you missed. I'll have to go back and look and see. But we were talking about the following things that we want to do. If we don't want to wind up like Lot and lose everything, we don't want to be worldly, we want to make sure we witness to our families, we want to make sure we're on guard against perversions, we want to make sure we walk the walk, and we want to make sure we prioritize spiritual things. Brother Christian brought up a very good point. Don't even pitch your tent towards Sodom. All right, how did God destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? Fire and brimstone. Now, there's another place where it says that Sodom and Gomorrah is the Dead Sea. When we look at the Dead Sea and the surrounding area today, what do we see? Do we see a lush area? No. What do we see?
Stone,
Uninhabitable.
An uninhabitable wasteland is what we see. But let's remember, why did Lot want to live there?
It was
Luscious.
It was luscious. Okay? So we see what the judgment of God did. It turned that beautiful, well-watered plain into the Dead Sea and into the barren wasteland that is around it. And do you know that archaeologists have dug in the ground and they have proven that it used to be a lush area? That's what you call climate change. And it wasn't brought about by a surplus of carbon. It was brought about by a surplus of sin. So there's you another good sermon, Brother Christian, global warming. Small example and big example. Sodom and Gomorrah, the small example, and Gog and Magog, the big example. The story of the flood would be a good example of climate change too. Amen. What brought about the climate change? The sin of man. All right, let's see. It is now 3 o'clock. So online students, I hope you didn't miss too much. I'll have to review and try to see what you did. But be working on your chapters in your book. Make sure you're answering your questions. And God willing, I will see you next week. God bless you.